All right, diving right in, some really fascinating stuff you sent our way.
Right.
It's all about getting to those key insights, really feeling like you've got a handle on things without wading through a ton of information.
Absolutely. Think of it like we're sifting through it all and highlighting what really matters.
Exactly. So today we're tackling something I think everyone can relate to, anger. You sent over some excerpts from Thich Nhat Hanh's book, Anger, Wisdom for Cooling the Flames.
Great book.
Yeah. And what we really want to do is equip you with some practical understanding of how to work with anger. Not just, pushing it down or letting it explode,
Mm.
but a more skillful way of approaching it.
Yeah, finding those tools that actually make a difference.
Right. It's about understanding it, working with it. So Thich Nhat Hanh starts the book with this really powerful story.
Okay.
It's about a wife who is driven to the point of contemplating suicide because her husband's anger is just constant.
Wow.
Yeah, and he'd been inviting her to these meditation retreats for years, and she was always resistant. But at this point, she's desperate. So she reaches out to a friend, a Buddhist practitioner,
Makes sense.
and her friend basically tells her, look, if you really want to help your husband, you need to learn to listen deeply, to listen with compassion.
Interesting.
And something they've been missing in their 5 years of suffering, this kind of real listening.
Mhm.
And the wife, she hears a talk about this kind of listening, and she's so moved that she wants to rush right home and try it out.
Makes sense.
But her friend wisely advises her to commit at least a week or two to train herself, to actually cultivate the ability to listen in this way.
Yeah.
It's not something you just suddenly know how to do, right? It's a practice.
Right.
So she decides to attend a 6-day retreat with a Catholic friend.
Okay.
And it's this incredibly immersive experience with 450 people all practicing mindfulness together.
Wow.
They're doing mindful breathing, mindful walking, really being present with every moment.
Sounds intense.
Yeah, and it's not just about individual practice. A big part of it is learning to listen to others, to communicate with what they call loving speech, really focusing on understanding the other person's suffering.
That makes a lot of sense.
So she goes home after this and she speaks to her husband with such love and tenderness, which is so different from how they'd been interacting for years.
Mm.
And he's so moved, he actually cries.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. And she feels this shift, like his heart is opening up again after being closed for so long.
Wow.
She keeps doing her mindful breathing, and she asks him to share what's really in his heart.
Really trying to understand.
Yeah. And just a few hours of this kind of deep, compassionate listening leads to this amazing reconciliation.
It's incredible, right?
Yeah.
Her husband's so touched, he ends up attending another retreat himself. He even later refers to his wife as a bodhisattva who saved his life.
Incredible.
And the author, Thich Nhat Hanh, makes this point, and I think it's really important. If your practice isn't leading to actual change, it's time to reassess how you're approaching it. Right. It needs to have a real impact.
Yeah. So he introduces this idea that anger isn't solely a psychological thing.
Okay.
He says it's very connected to our physical body and what we consume.
Interesting.
Yeah. And he talks about this Buddhist concept of namarupa.
Namarupa.
Yeah. It basically means our mind and body are not separate. They're this single unified reality, like two sides of the same coin, this mind-body formation.
Okay, so it's all interconnected.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what's really insightful is how he emphasizes that what we eat and drink directly affects our mental and emotional states, including how easily we get angry.
I can see that.
So he talks a lot about mindful eating. It's not just about what we eat, but how we eat.
Makes sense.
Chewing slowly, really tasting the food, being fully present while you're eating.
Yeah.
He even talks about not chewing our anger or anxiety along with our food.
Wow.
It's a pretty powerful image.
Yeah, it is. Like we're literally consuming negativity along with our meals.
Right. And this leads to what's called the 5th mindfulness training. It's all about mindful consumption.
Okay.
And he presents this as a path to liberation, not just for ourselves, but for society as a whole.
Interesting.
Yeah. The 5th mindfulness training is a commitment to only ingest things that cultivate peace, well-being, joy. Not just for our body, but for our mind, our families, communities.
So it's really holistic.
Very much so. And he connects this to the bigger picture, how mindless consumption contributes to so much suffering, even environmental issues.
That's a good point. It's all connected.
Exactly. He really encourages us to talk about this with our loved ones,
Right.
not just about food and drink, but what we watch, what we read, the conversations we have.
Creates a more mindful environment.
Exactly. It's about being mindful of what we're taking in every aspect of our lives. Really food for thought, right?
Yeah, it is.
So then he moves on to this core idea, understanding anger itself. He uses this metaphor of anger as a crying baby. And he says, anger, like a baby, needs to be held with mindful awareness, what he calls the mother energy.
Interesting.
And just acknowledging your anger, with your breath can bring immediate relief.
So it's about noticing it, not fighting it.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
He compares mindfulness to sunshine nourishing a flower, gently penetrating and transforming negative feelings. And he recognizes that when we first become aware of what he calls the garbage inside us, like fear or despair or hatred, our instinct is to panic.
Yeah, I can relate to that.
But he offers this alternative. He compares it to an organic gardener who takes waste and turns it into compost. So instead of being afraid of these negative emotions, we can see them as something that can actually nourish our growth.
That's a really good analogy.
It's a totally different way of looking at it.
It is.
So he explains that we tend to get angry easily because our seed of anger is strong.
Okay.
And it's been, watered a lot, so it's really strong. It's like a plant that's been given a ton of fertilizer. It just grows and grows.
Right.
He contrasts this with people who can stay calm in similar situations. And this is where mindfulness comes in, to help us change those deep-seated patterns.
Yeah, it takes practice to break those habits.
It really does. And then he says something really profound. He says, the person who's making you suffer is also suffering themselves. And they need help, not punishment.
That's a really powerful shift in perspective.
It is. And this connects to the idea that you can transform your anger into compassion. He talks about practices like walking meditation and mindful looking, really seeing the other person.
So it's about recognizing their humanity.
Absolutely. And he shares this touching story about a 12-year-old boy at Plum Village who's struggling with his dad's anger.
Okay.
Through his practice, the boy realizes his own anger is this habit energy that's been passed down from his father, like inherited almost.
Wow.
Right. And then he has this realization that his dad was also a victim of this cycle. It's not like he was intentionally trying to hurt him.
Yeah.
He was caught in this pattern of suffering himself. And just that understanding makes the boy's anger dissolve. And he's filled with this desire to go home and practice with his dad.
That's amazing, especially for a kid that age.
It is.
Yeah.
It really shows how understanding the roots of suffering, both ours and others, can be so transformative. So what can we actually do?
Right.
Well, he talks about our inner garden. It needs tending. And he says even 1 minute of mindful practice can generate this energy of presence.
Okay.
And he gives this simple but powerful practice. When you see someone, say silently to yourself, darling, I know you are there, and I am very happy.
Wow.
It's about really acknowledging the other person with mindfulness.
It's like setting a positive intention for the interaction.
Exactly. And that makes it much less likely that anger is going to arise.
That makes sense.
He also talks about the importance of talking openly with loved ones, creating a strategy of peace. This means agreeing on things like mindful consumption, deciding together what you want to bring into your shared environment.
So it's a conscious effort to create a peaceful space.
Yeah. And he tells this story about a young American guy who was estranged from his dad for 5 years. They couldn't even communicate.
Oh, wow.
And the son encounters the Dharma, and it really changes him. He becomes a monk and spends several months at Plum Village practicing mindfulness, including mindful consumption. And eventually he feels ready to try and reconnect with his dad. He's able to reestablish communication. It really shows how personal transformation through mindfulness can open doors that seemed closed before.
Yeah, amazing.
So before we can make real changes in our lives, he says we need to look at our diet.
Okay.
And he's not just talking about food, it's everything we take in. Thoughts, media, any unhealthy habits. We need to stop consuming things that are toxic. Negative self-talk, violent content, harmful substances.
Right. It's about creating space for positivity.
Exactly.
Yep.
Then those better parts of ourselves can emerge, and we're not controlled by anger and frustration anymore. And communication is key.
Of course.
He makes this point about taking responsibility. Don't wait for others to change. You have to act first.
Be the change you want to see.
Right. And he talks about compassionate communication. He emphasizes that anger is a part of being human.
Makes sense.
And like any discomfort, like a stomachache, it needs our care. We shouldn't try to ignore it, but embrace it with mindfulness.
Be present with it.
Yeah. And he introduces what he calls the 3 sentences of true love.
Interesting.
They are acknowledging the other person's suffering, affirming their positive qualities that you see in them, and then expressing your own suffering and looking at how you contribute to the situation.
So taking responsibility while also being empathetic.
Exactly. And he even suggests carrying a pebble in your pocket as a reminder to be mindful.
Like a physical cue.
Yeah, you touch it, and it reminds you to pause, take a breath, and reconnect with your intention to communicate mindfully. He also explains that true love and compassion come from understanding non-duality.
Non-duality.
This idea of interbeing, how
Yeah.
everything's interconnected. So harming someone else is ultimately harming yourself.
Like that spiderweb analogy.
Exactly. And when it comes to expressing anger, he gives this wise approach.
Uh.
First, you recognize the feeling.
Okay.
Second, you bring your attention back to yourself, maybe through your breath.
Okay.
And third, later on, you communicate your suffering without blaming and really listen to the other person's perspective.
So you're not reacting in the heat of the moment.
Right. And he talks about selective watering.
What's that?
It's intentionally nurturing the positive qualities in yourself and others instead of focusing on the negative.
Ah, I see.
He tells this story about a husband who, after being reminded to do this, starts watering his wife's positive seeds. And it really improves her well-being in their relationship.
That's sweet.
Yeah, it is. It shows the power of positive reinforcement. Now, transforming anger into compassion, it takes time, consistent practice.
Right. It's a process.
Yeah. And he talks about anger that comes from wrong perceptions, how important it is to examine our own beliefs.
Because sometimes we're just wrong.
Right. Exactly. He gives this example of a man who wrongly believed his son wasn't actually his, and it caused so much unnecessary suffering.
Wow. That's a powerful example.
It is. So even when we think someone's wrong, listening with compassion is crucial. The goal is to help them express themselves and suffer less.
It's about creating a safe space for them to be heard.
Exactly. And he reminds us that anger is a living thing. It takes time to subside. And he revisits habit energy.
Okay.
He says mindfulness helps us recognize those patterns and not react impulsively.
Right.
He gives this relatable example of a guy shopping for Thanksgiving who suddenly becomes aware of his mom's habit of always rushing, and he even sees that tendency in himself. And then he talks about restoring pure land, which is inner peace and harmony in relationships. And he introduces this practice of writing a book on yourself.
Okay.
It's basically deep self-reflection to understand and transform your own suffering.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he warns us about getting too attached to ideas, saying they can become like prisons. Yeah, it's better to experience the wonders of life through mindful living. He even suggests writing a crucial letter, using loving speech and understanding to resolve conflicts. He says it's even more important than academic pursuits.
Wow.
So when it comes to practices, mindful breathing is essential. He suggests breathing in, I am aware of my anger. Breathing out, I embrace my anger.
Okay.
It's about acknowledging and accepting the emotion without judgment. He also talks about deep relaxation, which is like a body scan, to connect with your body and release tension. And belly breathing, especially when emotions are strong.
So it's about calming the body and mind.
Yeah. And then he talks about seeds of anger in our consciousness.
Okay.
And he says it's so important to water the seeds of mindfulness, to counteract them. And then this really profound idea of inner being, the idea of no enemies.
No enemies.
Yeah. He says when you really grasp the interconnectedness of everything, compassion naturally arises. The idea of a separate enemy just dissolves. He even brings up that saying of Christ's, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing.
Powerful.
Yeah. It's about recognizing the ignorance behind harmful actions. And this understanding goes beyond our personal relationships. He talks about collective insight, using skillful means to address societal anger and violence.
So applying these principles on a larger scale.
Exactly. And he tells a story about a vegetarian son who uses a documentary to gently shift his family's eating habits, showing how compassion can create positive change.
That's a good example.
Yeah. He emphasizes that the capacity for love's always there, even in the midst of anger and hate. And he talks about having compassion for our parents, recognizing their suffering shaped them and in turn shaped us.
It's about breaking the cycle.
It is. And he talks about serving our country, not through blind allegiance, but through understanding the roots of suffering. Then he closes with this allegory of David and Angelina. They represent our relationships and how we blame each other. David can't truly listen to Angelina, even though she's right there with him. It shows how we need incense of mindfulness, which is concentration and insight, to really communicate and cherish those important people in our lives.
It's a reminder to be present in our relationship.
Absolutely. So to wrap up, we've explored this deep connection between our mind and body, how anger is really a part of us that's suffering and needs our compassionate attention, and how powerful mindfulness and compassionate listening can be. We've seen how crucial it is to understand the root causes of anger, including our own misperceptions and habits, and ultimately how we can transform ourselves and our relationships through consistent practice.
It's about cultivating wisdom and compassion, both for ourselves and for the world around us.
Exactly. So, as a final thought, who are your Angelinas, those important people in your life? What's one small, mindful action you can take today to offer them incense of the heart? Or maybe to work with your own anger? Perhaps diving deeper into the 5 mindfulness trainings could be a good next step for you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.